Okay, last video. So I'm going to cover something that is probably brand new for everyone. I want to make sure everybody does this, and this will also greatly assist with both your homework and the assignment. So in general, when it comes to the book, which is handy dandy right here, what I'd like you to read for just this week is chapter 1, Jurisdiction and Venue in Cyberspace. Now this is going to be a lot of dense material, but it's really, really important that you gather it and read it and make sure that it makes sense. I'm also going to be going over an element that is not in the book, but I do want to make sure that I will cover it either via Zoom or via video lecture next week. I want you to read one of the cases that I will explain today, and I'll make sure that it makes sense here, but I want you to read it and see if you can gather both the test and the application of the test and why it's important. Right? It's also going to be a little bit in the PowerPoint, so that might help too. Now, in general, the civil justice system is how we recover private wrongs against private parties. Right? So the general idea of the civil justice system, and I'm going to go away for a quick second so you can see the full slide. The general idea of the civil justice system is that we allow people to sue other people for damages that are caused, right? Now, when it comes to sort of damages in general, they can be monetary damages or they can be action damages, right? Monetary damages are like, I lent $500 to you, you didn't pay me, I would like my $500 back, thank you very much. I would sue you in court, the court would give me a judgment, I would enforce that judgment, right? That seems pretty basic. What you're going to be reading about are things called injunctions. Now, injunctions are different, and they are essentially legal civil decisions that tell people to either do something or force them not to do something, which I know sounds kind of peculiar, but it's actually very common. For example, if I wanted to build a big sign on the top of my roof that said, go Philadelphia Phillies, and my neighborhood was like, you're not allowed to have signs like that, right? Makes sense. They would file an injunction in the court that would stop me from building that sign, and if I refused to do it, I could get thrown in jail. The other way that you see a lot of injunctive relief is against the government. If the government passes a law that is unconstitutional, they are allowed to be sued for an injunction that bars them from being able to do that conduct in the future. Right? Now, again, they're brought by private parties, so it's not like the government can be sued, but it's not like this criminal justice system where the government is really the engine that moves everything forward. Also, the standard of proof is less than in criminal court instead of beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just something called a preponderance of the evidence. We're just seeing how there we go, the scales skip. Now, the essential idea of the criminal justice system is that you have to be able to establish the basis of your claim and the basis of your recovery. Now, this is a big thing, right? Because you essentially need to know what are the elements of law you need to prove, and then also, are you able to prove actual damages? Now, this is a factual and legal distinction that comes up a lot in your homework, because the two cases that you have, Zippo and Islands Online, both deal with legal problems, right? So in a nutshell, Islands Online deals with classification of websites on the internet. Essentially, the discussion here is whether or not an online website is allowed to sue a domain name registrar for a violation of their First Amendment rights. Right? Now, if you remember something I talked about before, I said, well, only the government is involved when it comes to your First Amendment rights, so how could it be possible that an online name registrar, let's say GoDaddy.com is the best one that I can think of, where, hey, we'll get your name together, right? Now, I would also note that the plaintiff in this case wants to register like dirty names, and you'll probably see that. The idea in general here is because the government was involved in the creation of the internet, does the Constitution apply to the private party that's involved? Now, the facts can be technical, but I actually kind of feel like in that case, they're kind of interesting. The issue in that case, and the only thing I want you to decide, is solely whether or not a domain name registrar is effectively the government for purposes of the Constitution. That's the only focus I want you to have. And I'll note that on the PowerPoint that is on Campus Web, I've gone over those details a little bit more in depth. Now, the other case is Zippo, and Zippo is going to get super complicated, but it also deals with something in the criminal justice system about personal jurisdiction. I'm going to talk about that later, and I'll talk about that next week. I'll probably do that via the Zoom lecture, and that'll be the big basis of what our class will be, because it's a really technical topic that I want to make sure is clear right now. The main idea with both of these cases is they have to both know the elements of law and have facts that support those elements. So both of those cases deal with, there's a test, do the facts satisfy that test? That's the most important thing. right? Now, in general, this is generally how the legal system works. You've got pre-filing concerns, pleadings, discovery, dispository motions, trials, and appeals, right? That's just how the civil justice system operates. Now, in general, both of these cases deal with pre-filing concerns and pleading concerns, meaning the very introduction of how litigation works. So I just want to walk through these really quickly. Pleadings are essentially a complaint and an answer. A complaint, in general, is how you start a legal action. We can go over it next week, but it isn't that important for right now. But essentially, the idea is if you owed me $500 and I wanted to sue you for it, I'd have to prepare a written document that outlined all of my claims, why I'm entitled to my rights that I'm entitled to, and what are my damages, right? That's the base level. Additionally, they have to establish certain jurisdictional requirements like subject matter jurisdiction, and the big one is personal jurisdiction that we're going to talk about before. But that's the real basis of how a lawsuit really starts, right? Pleadings, introductory documents that set the stage for the rest of the case, right? Now, in general, how it works is the plaintiff files the complaint and the defendant files the answer. There are a few differences in how this works, like with class actions and other things, but usually every pleading needs a response, right? Now, the reason why I'm letting you know this is it's important to note the context of where both of these cases have operated. In regard to Zippo, it's an extremely early decision. It's all the way up at pleadings at the very second level, meaning we filed the complaint and the other side is like, we're not hearing anything that's going on. This is not moving anywhere forward, and that's allowed. The other case, Islands Online, yes, is more of a dispository motion summary judgment. They gathered all the evidence and now they're making a determination as to whether or not the Constitution applies. So these are just different levels of the original civil justice system, but I think it's just generally important to kind of know where everything goes. Now, in addition, when you file a civil complaint, one of the interesting things is that you actually have to give it to somebody. This is often a plot device in a lot of movies where people are served with a complaint randomly. I have it on Parks and Recreation, if that reference makes any sense to anyone, where Ron Swanson punches somebody and then somebody serves him with a complaint. That's what happens in all lawsuits. You have to be given the complaint in order for it to apply. Now, why I bring that up is because jurisdiction is incredibly important with bringing a lawsuit. Essentially, jurisdiction decides whether or not you're allowed to bring a lawsuit in the jurisdiction you have. Now, this is the example I like to give. If I go to Florida, right, and while I'm in Florida, I get in a car accident and I break my leg, and I want to sue that other person who got in that car accident because I'd like to get damages for my broken leg. Although for me, it makes sense that I would be able to sue in Delaware because that's where I live, practically speaking, it makes no sense to sue in Delaware because the defendant's in Florida, the evidence is in Florida, the law is in Florida, the witnesses are in Florida, the cops are in Florida, everybody's in Florida. So in general, you have to consider how much your case is related to the jurisdiction you want to file your lawsuit in. And that's what personal jurisdiction is. It's actually protected by the Constitution, and it actually is there and it serves to just protect the defendant. It's the plaintiff's burden to establish these elements. So the background of the Zippo case, if you've ever, seen a lighter, I'm assuming you're all in college, so I'm making over assumptions here, but a Zippo is like a fancy lighter, right? And that is generally what that word means to everybody. There's a website called Zippo News or whatever. And essentially, the lighter wants to sue the website and saying, hey, you're stealing our intellectual property. You've stolen our name, right? Now, the plaintiff in that case wants to file their lawsuit in one jurisdiction, but the defendant says, that's not the right jurisdiction. I don't deserve to be sued here. And the balance here is, when I gave you the example of the car accident, that's very factually easy. You're in Florida, your leg's broken. It is what it is, right? All that evidence is there. But it gets really complicated in cyber law. And we're going to get through it in a lot of detail next week. But the main thing being is, how do you determine the locality of evidence? How do you determine where something belongs when everything is over the internet? This actually has come up to me in my private practice a lot of times. I represented a guy who did an online sale for security. And everything was online. The products were online. Everything was intangible. So when they had a dispute regarding the contract, there was a big question about like, where do we sue this guy? And there was a big problem about personal jurisdiction. Now, in general, the concept is hard. The application, I would argue, is easy. And again, we're going to go over this with greater depth next week. Essentially, the first main thing we want to know is, are you in the state you're suing in, right? So again, the idea that we're looking for is, what is the locality of the lawsuit? What state is it being filed in, right? Once we determine that, we determine what are the defendants' connections with that state. Are they in that state? Do they live in that state? Do they do business in that state? Have they committed an injury in that state? Those are the big questions we have there, right? The other thing as we're kind of developing is, what is the basis of how connected that is to the state, to how connected it is to the litigation? We're going to get into all that next week, and I want to kind of save that for next week with greater detail. But in general, that's the approach I want you to look at. When you look at the Zippo case, I want you to go, what's the jurisdiction? I believe it's Pennsylvania, right? The idea that they're going to ask is, the defendant website, right? How connected is it to Pennsylvania? And I think the answer might be somewhat surprising. But again, that's the only thing I want you to ask. What is the test? What are they looking for? What is the evidence they're looking for? What are the facts they're looking for? Now that leads me finally into our last slide, which is the idea of the case brief. Now, this is what I ask you for you to do for your homework. And I know in previous classes, often, I just want to see how you're practicing it. But because it's an online class from here on out, I'd like you to put a little bit more depth into the idea of how we're putting this together. The idea here is, what's the issue? And I'm going to give you the issue for both of these cases. For Islands Online, it's again, whether or not an online registrar of websites is connected enough to the government to implicate the Constitution. And they have a four-part test that I've highlighted that you need to look into. You can see it in the head notes. You can see it in the case, right? In regard to the facts, I just want you to be able to summarize what happened. The only thing I want to know is that, like, you don't cut and paste. I hate cutting and pasting. Please don't do it, all right? With the rationale, I want you to be able to isolate only the relevant rules of law and how they applied. The main thing I just want you to do here is read and just explain to me what you think the answer is. If you use I, me, you, pronouns, whatever, I'm perfectly fine. But I want you to be able to isolate what are the rules and why do the rules give the victory to one person, right? And then the holding, again, is just the court's answer to that question, right? Who wins? What's the answer, right? And so the idea is, does an online domain register implicate the Constitution? The holding should be yes, it does, or no, it doesn't, and why, right? For Zippo, the question is whether or not an online news site is liable for personal jurisdiction wherever, if it's online, because again, online's a little bit everywhere. The facts, again, I just want you to tell me who the both parties are. And the rationale is just, what do you think the test of personal jurisdiction is, and how do you think it's been applied? The court's holding, again, is who do you think wins, and what's the answer to the original question? The main thing I'm going to note is this. The law is complex, the law is difficult, and the law is hard, right? I mean, there's no disputing in that. I don't care so much that you understand what the material is after reading it, because I do think it can be hard. I want you to understand it, obviously, but it's not make or break if you get it perfectly the second you walk into the virtual door of class. The main thing I just want to make sure that you're understanding, where that makes sense to you, is that after we talk about it, it makes sense. So do your best on your homework, but don't panic, at least just yet. Otherwise, I'm going to send you more emails in the future. My expectation is that we're going to be using Zoom in the future, but I do tend to think that these online lectures are, if they work, we'll keep doing them. But we'll kind of see how Zoom goes, and we'll see how everything operates. And we'll make sure that everyone understands everything and that every exam makes perfect sense to you. Again, my email is bendisis@gbc.edu. Please email me if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, if anything comes up, because I'm here to help and I want to make sure everything makes sense. Otherwise, good luck with everything, and I'll see you next week.